The winter cold has arrived, but the Danish concept of hygge is heating up the hearts and minds of communities near and far from the Scandinavian country. But what exactly is hygge? It roughly translates as a quality of coziness and comfort that promises warmth, safety and community. Regarded as a defining characteristic of Danish culture, hygge has quickly become a global sensation, and the best-selling book, The Little Book of Hygge, The Danish Way to Live Well, has been sharing the mindset one candle and cup of hot chocolate at a time. But how do Chinese people attain their own version of happiness, and how can we all incorporate more happiness habits and mindsets into our everyday lives, no matter which culture we are part of? I'm pleased to be joined by Meik Wiking, founder and CEO of the world's first Happiness Research Institute and also author of that best-selling book. Thank you very much, Michael, for joining me here in the
Thanks
studio.
for having me.
Thank you. So tell us a little bit about this fascinating word. Was my translation roughly correct?
It was spot on, and well done on the pronunciation
Thank
as well.
you. I tried a little bit.
I think the best short definition of what hygge is the art of creating a nice atmosphere. So it's these moments where we experience comfort, togetherness, relaxation, pleasure from simple things, harmony, and of course that happens everywhere. I've experienced here in Beijing as well, and I receive letters from readers from France, from US, from Germany, saying that I've been having hygge all my life. I just didn't know there was a word for it.
Oh.
And
why is it such a Danish thing then? Why is the Danish word for it and not necessarily in other languages?
Right, yeah, so it happens everywhere. The thing is that Danes have a word that describes that situation, which probably makes us more conscious of when it happens. We're also quite happy to point out when it does happen. And secondly, Danes see hygge as part of our national culture, part of our national DNA.
Because of the long winters, or?
I mean, hygge happens throughout the year, but you're right. I mean, for us, it's almost like a survival strategy for winter. It's, you know, it's dark, it's cold, and hygge is a way to make the best use of that period of year.
Well, but I understand it must not just be the physical atmosphere, right, for people in tropical areas. Is there also their tropical version of hygge that they can create in their lives, or?
I mean, so when we...
Because this is the international bestseller, people must find something in common.
Right, yes, yeah. And I think, you know, hygge happens in the summertime as well in Denmark. We also consider it hyggely having a picnic at the beach, or having a midsummer bonfire late at night. So it's something that happens throughout the year. Every time you bring good people together over some good food, hopefully that's a hyggely experience.
Well, then I would say, don't we all have that? I mean, in France, in Germany, in the UK, in the United States, in China, we all go on holidays, we all gather around the table. But why is this particular word standing out and embraced by people from so many countries, and at this particular moment? Did you think about it?
I think it has to do with several things. I think, first of all, it is a universal feeling, it is a universal experience. Then what the book did was it gave people a language to label that experience with and appreciate it in any way. And secondly, I think these years there's also an extra interest in the Nordic countries, an extra interest in Denmark, because I think there's a growing realization that we have become richer, a lot of societies have become richer without necessarily people have becoming happier. And there is an increasing recognition that Denmark and the Nordic countries are doing something well in terms of delivering good conditions for good lives, and that has brought increased interest to Scandinavia and the Nordic countries.
But do you think this idea or this philosophy or this thinking process can be borrowed by people in other countries which are not so materially well developed, which does not probably have a very safe social welfare net?
I mean, that's what I hear from readers from different countries of the world. So for us, hygge is not about material stuff. It's an atmosphere. It's about the connection with other people. It's about savoring the simple things in life. So it's something that seems accessible to people in different countries. But of course, it's only part of a long equation of why Denmark does well in the happiness rankings, which is one of my sort of core fields that I try to understand. A lot of it has to do with the Danish welfare model, a focus on equality between rich and poor, focus on equality between men and women, high level of good governance, low level of corruption, access to healthcare, access to university education, a high level of trust. Those factors are why Denmark, along with the other Nordic countries, are often doing well in the happiness.
Yeah, because I have been reading book reviews and people's interpretation and reporting on this book, and sometimes I find it a little bit confusing, because people are saying, look, make your home comfortable, put a lot of fabrics, I don't know, you know, even comparing this to cocooning and talking about making the toilet clean, or talking about, of course, I'm definitely not against anything in that regard. And do you think these ideas are kind of misleading, thinking by creating physically cozy environment, you can actually create happiness?
I think we need to look at happiness from a broader point of view than that. I think we need to look at happiness the same way we look at health. So if we were to understand why do some people live longer than others, we can see that roughly there are three categories. We can see that genetics matter, that we're born more or less healthy, we're predisposed for some diseases. Secondly, we can see that the cities we live in, the countries we live in, the policies we live under impact our longevity, our health, access to healthcare, level of air pollution, and so on. And then the choices we make on a daily basis.
Absolutely.
Do we smoke? Do we exercise? What kind of diet do we have? And I think the same three categories apply also for happiness. We can see we are born more or less happy. There are some people that are more genetically disposed for happiness, the same way that some people are genetically disposed for some mental illnesses. We can see that the countries we live in, the policies we live under, the cities we live in, the circumstances we have, also impact how we feel about our lives and impact the levels of happiness. And then the choices we make. What do we spend our time on? Who do we spend our time with? And that impacts happiness. So I think we need to look at happiness from a broad spectrum.
How much is personal elements, besides the genetic elements, besides the big atmosphere and environment, besides our daily habits and what we do and who are with, how much is personal attitudes and mindset determining how happy we feel?
Let me start with the second factor, if I may. So the policies we live under, the countries we live in, we can see when we look at the World Happiness Report, there's 155 countries in that one. Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland often do well in those. The least happy countries are, unsurprisingly, Syria, Burundi, the Central African Republic, poor, politically unstable countries. If we look at that spectrum of countries, we can see that we can explain 75% of the variance among those countries with relatively few factors. GDP per capita, healthy life expectancy, freedom to make life choices, freedom from corruption, generosity, and social support. That explains the majority of difference between the countries. But of course there's a lot of variance within those countries, and that brings us to the sort of third factor. So that there is inequalities in well-being also within those countries.
In terms of the cultural perspective, do you see some difference between different cultures, for instance, between Asian cultures? What are the things that make the Asians feel more happy or secure that not necessarily in other parts of the world?
Right. What I see, the more I talk with people, the more I dive into the data, the more I dive into the research and visit different cities and different countries, is the realization of how similar we are. We're Chinese and we're Danish, or American and Germans, but we're first and foremost people. And I can see that in the data. I can see what drives happiness here in Beijing also drives happiness in Copenhagen. So we can see there's a lot of common denominators.
Yeah.
But the case of China, the case of Asia is of course different, because you are in a different phase than my country is. You have a different history, there's also a different culture, there's a rapid transformation right now, there's rapid growth, and I see that also in other countries. There is rapid urbanization,
Right.
and people are changing standards of living.
The dilemma is that, the more people modernize, the more people urbanize, it seems they're less happy.
Right. Yeah.
I do not know. Some of the happiest countries are probably, let's say, people in Bhutan, for instance. They're considered not the richest country, but they're very happy. They're perceived to be very happy.
Right.
And traditionally, the Chinese philosophy is that we don't have to have much. We just have to be content with what we have, or we don't have to go to extreme and pursue everything. We need to stay relatively moderate, or pretty much in the middle of things, not too extreme. The Chinese thinking of zhongyong, right? So I'm talking about it from a cultural and philosophical perspective. Is that also what is agreed, what is shared by people from other cultures?
I'd say so. And you mentioned Bhutan. You're right. I mean, they're not the happiest in the world. They're currently, I think, 78th place. But they have.
Okay, that's not very high, according to different standards. I guess.
Right. Yeah. But you are describing right things. You're right that. For instance, when people move to bigger cities, then they can become less happy, and in part that may have to do with a higher level of loneliness in the bigger cities. We've left small towns, we've left our villages, and that community spirit we experience back home, we might struggle to find in the bigger cities. So there might be a higher level of loneliness. That's part of it. What also happens sometimes when people move to the bigger cities to seek opportunities, to seek jobs, is that our expectations change. Who we compare ourselves with change. What we can see when it comes to money and happiness, the relationship there is that yes, on average, richer countries are happier, richer people are happier, but what seems to matter to people is their relative income.
Well, I do not know whether richer people are happier or richer countries are happier, because I see more suicide rates in northern European countries than in Switzerland, where I was. Right. People are very bothered by things that, for instance, a poor person in Chinese would dream of. They think they don't have a focus in life, they don't have a purpose in life, they would commit suicide because of small things, what we think, some people think with small things. Whereas here, if someone has a very difficult life, but they say, I'm going to go and do this, I'm going to achieve this, whatever the circumstances, they probably feel happier in another way.
So what we see in the data, if you look at the World Health Organization, is currently Sri Lanka has the highest suicide rate in the world. If you look at OECD, South Korea, you're right, has the highest suicide rate in OECD. If we take the case of Denmark, what is interesting there is we used to have one of the highest suicide rates in the world. So in 1980, we used to have the highest suicide rate for women. Fortunately, that has been dropping and cut to a third. So it used to be 32 per 100,000. Now it's 9 per 100,000. So we used to be first. Now we're 106.
What happened?
So there's several explanations. Because you're right. I mean, sometimes you get to a level of affluence, and then you start to question, I have all these things, why am I not still happy? And then you start to question yourself. So what has been happening is better treatment, but also better preventive care, hotlines, and very important, a reduction in the stigma, the taboo around mental illness. So trying to normalize the conversation around mental health has been really important.
I'm sorry, I cannot agree yet. I understand there's great improvement. I think it needs to come from within, right? It needs to come from within. The symptoms of stigma or of mental, I do not know the several factors that you mentioned. Are they able to really address the core question of how do we make us happier?
I think targeting reducing unhappiness, targeting reducing misery is part of the equation in terms of make people happier. What I think also is the case for the Nordic countries is that they have been really good at reducing causes for misery. So for instance, if we compare Denmark to the US, we'll see that on average Denmark is happier than the US, and the big difference is if we look at the low income group. There's the big difference. If we look at middle income, if we look at high income, no big difference. Yeah.
So what really we have to wrap up, but I would really like to hear, what do you think countries like China, countries like South Korea or Japan, you know, with our Asian culture, with our relatively better developed economy, what do you think people can do really to become happier?
I think there is a lot of good things happening already. We see China increase in the chart. I think it has to do with several things. I think we need to figure out how do we bring that community feeling we experienced in the smaller towns into the bigger city in conjunction with urbanization. I think that's part of it. I think considering at a people level, at a community level, at a country level, how do we convert the wealth that we have created and the tremendous growth that you are experiencing these years, how do we convert that wealth into well-being? How do we invest our resources most efficiently to bring quality of life for people? That's second, and then I think addressing mental health care is a very important third step.
Anything one person can do on a personal level? A hot cooker on a cold winter day?
I mean,
very briefly, please.
Especially the first part. You know, figure out how do we take our streets and turn them into communities? How do we connect with neighbors and create a community spirit in the bigger cities?
Okay, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Meik Wiking, founder and CEO of Happiness Research Institute and also author of the international bestseller, The Little Book of Hygge, The Danish Way to Live Well.
Thank you.
And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.